Welcome to the Inquiring Spirit podcast. I'm Ravi Joseph, and I'm here with Bharath Vallabha. Welcome, Bharath.
Thanks, Ravi. Hey, how are you?
Good. How about you?
I'm doing well. Doing well. Glad to be having another conversation.
Yeah, me as well. So today we were going to talk about the topic of essentialism versus non-essentialism. So this is kind of a topic in philosophy about whether there are kind of essences behind concepts or ideas, and sometimes those are thought of as in this field of spiritual philosophy. Those are kind of thought of as spiritual essences, like whether there's a kind of spiritual essence of goodness or of beauty or something like that that you can come into contact with. There are lots of ways of thinking about this, and so in this debate, not debate, discussion, I think will mostly be kind of polarizing around two positions, with Bharath being the more non-essentialist view and my being the more essentialist view. And if you've seen some of our other podcasts, this might actually kind of correlate to some of our other philosophical positions as well. Um, so yeah, with that, Bharat, why don't I'd love to hear your kind of introduction on maybe your view on this issue and how it relates to any other philosophical views you've had, or even personal reasons why this has been a relevant issue in your life, or yeah, anything that seems relevant to introduce the topic.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Ravi. Uh, I would say, yeah, this has probably been one of the central questions I've been thinking about for a long time. And I might have shifted more from the essentialist position to the non-essentialist position. And I'd say why it matters and why it matters to me. Uh, so in a way, I think about it in terms of the question of the meaning of life, right? So, is there a purpose to life? Is there a purpose to my life, to life in general? These are all slightly different questions, but they're kind of asking something similar. And one can say that I think of the essential. So there's kind of a metaphysical way of thinking about this essential versus non-essential topic, which is kind of like, is there something that does everything have an essence for what it is to be what it is, right? So do human beings have something that make them essentially a human being? Is there something essential to being a man, say, that somehow all men are aiming to be, right? Is there something essential to being uh, artificial intelligence? Is there something you could think about anything, right? Um, and then the non-essentialist kind of says, no, there isn't anything. They don't have to have something in common. The most, I think, in the 20th century, perhaps the most famous version of this in philosophy was Ludwig Wittgenstein's idea about family resemblances. The idea being that even things that belong to the same category don't have to have anything in common. So men in general don't have to have anything that is the essence of being a man that they have in common, but rather they're sort of these family resemblances, so that they have some things in common and some things not in common. So you and I might both be men, but not because we have some common core that is absolutely the same, but because we have some like overlapping similarities of traits and personalities and whatever biological uh, uh, structures, right? And so that's a deep question in sort of about the nature of things. Um, for me, part of the question personally has been: is there something like the essence of life or the universe that or humanity that we are sort of trying to realize, right? And I think I began very much from that position of, yes, there has to be a meaning to this. We're kind of getting to a meaning. There is a telos, an end to human growth, clear stages that it goes through. And over the last, several years, I've sort of drifted away from that more into, no, there is no particular meaning. Rather, we create the meaning. And when we create it, we can create it in any number of different ways. Right. And so there's nothing propelling that it has to be created in a particular way. And I think I'm more drawn to that now because it seems to take more into account sort of the individuality and variability of life, and a kind of humility that goes with it. Uh, Counterside is that it can kind of lead to worries of nihilism and meaninglessness in a certain way as well. All right, but let me stop there. I think that's kind of the angle from which I'm kind of coming to this, mixing together the metaphysical questions and the sort of meaning questions together. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, thanks for the intro. So I guess I'll give some of my thoughts as well. Um, so I think there are compelling reasons to not be an essentialist. I think when you take these kinds of like analytic arguments and like say like, well, let's try to discover the essence, and then you kind of take an analytic approach and say, well, I can't actually pin down any essence and to this thing. I can't pin down the essence of a game because there are so many different categories of games and different ways that games function and different purposes of a game. Well, yeah, I can't really find out what the essence of a game is. And if I then that might be a reason to think maybe there is no essence of a game. It's just this kind of ways that language is used to structure the category of games, and that's not actually the doesn't line up to any kind of spiritual, energetic quality that all games have. I think that's a compelling argument. Um, but I still find the kind of essentialist view kind of compelling in other ways. And the only way I can describe this is like in my life as a philosopher, and well, I'll get to this word philosopher in a second, but in my time as a philosopher, some of the deepest insights that I feel I've had into the nature of reality have kind of had this essentialist quality. Like I remember when I came across the idea of true names, that seemed very deep to me. The idea that there could be like say you have in the kind of post-Saussurian linguistic view, there's no reason why a certain thing has to be named a certain thing. You could, if everybody agreed to call something something else, it would also be called. It would just be called that thing. So I think in Plato dialogue, there's like if you called a horse something other than a horse, would it still be a horse, or would that be the real name of it? So if everybody agreed to call a horse a cup, then the cup would be the name of the horse, and we'd all just know refer to a horse as a cup, and then we could all agree on that. But the theory of true names is that there's actually a unique name that kind of corresponds to the nature of that object or that thing that kind of forms this unique correspondence between the essence or the reality of that thing and the name itself. And I think for certain names, that's an incredibly compelling view for me. The first name that comes to mind is Sri Aurobindo, who's a very important philosopher, yogi, guru in my life, and that name is inseparable from my connection to the energetic quality that I perceive in that being. And if it was called anything else, it would not have that same relationship. So there's something about that name that has a particular correspondence between that name and that essence. So yeah, that's not a proof of the theory of true names. It's just something that I find incredibly compelling. Similar insight I've had a couple of years ago is around the idea of the logos, which is the idea of there being a kind of linguistic organization to the nature of reality. So um, um, all the different qualities of reality can be thought of by the mind as being differentiated by the different words that we use, and those words having an organizing power. So when I think of the different qualities or traits that maybe Bharath and I have, that maps out uh, a system of differences that corresponds to real qualities about the world and real energies that underlie the world. So when I look at Bharath and myself, we were just talking about health, and so I'm a little bit more on the heavy side than Bharath, and Bharath is a little bit lighter, and so that is one category of or one terrain of difference between us. So the areas of overweight and maybe more ideal body weight are kind of laid out in that difference between us by those terms, overweight and closer to ideal body weight or whatever. Um, and those are kind of the essences behind those things. And so again, this is not a and same with psychological qualities. So I'm trying to think of what psychological qualities that we might have that differ. But yeah, if you named a particular psychological word and it applied more to me than to Bharath, then we could say that yeah, this is the kind of true essence of that psychological quality. It's defined in that energetic difference between us. Um, so in that way, we contact the essence of these kind of differentiations based on these words. And so again, this is a kind of essentialist kind of viewpoint because you're holding that there's some kind of terrain that's mapped out by any given distinction that corresponds to spiritual energies, and that those energies um, kind of map to the categories that we're using. And again, that's not a proof. It doesn't refute Wittgenstein's idea about language games, but I just find it incredibly deep and compelling as a way to view reality, and that feels like a deep insight into things. So the I guess what I'd say in response to something like the Wittgenstein argument is that, well, perhaps we can't analytically define or specify the the full nature of a category or an energy, but that doesn't mean we can't. That doesn't mean that it's non-existent. It just means we can't necessarily specify it. So there might be problems with that argument, but that's just my first initial response. Um, yeah, so that's my interest in the question of essentialism versus non-essentialism. So maybe non-essentialism might win on some technical points, but I find essentialism kind of a compelling view in the sense that it feels like it gives some deep insights into reality. So we also haven't touched on the idea of idealism, and specifically the idealism found in Sri Aurobindo's works, where um, there are where the world is viewed as kind of incarnations of ideas. So everything in the world being an incarnation of an idea, and this is of course related to ideas that are brought up in Plato and Hegel, and has a long history in Western philosophy. And yeah, I think you can poke a lot of holes in this sort of thinking, but at the same time, it's just incredibly compelling and rich. And when you feel like you grasp it, you feel like you are coming into something deep about reality. So that is why I find the essentialist view compelling, and not necessarily on the technical merits of the arguments. Not to say that non-essentialism is a merely technical viewpoint. There might be compelling things about it as well, but that's the kind of way I view it at this point. Yeah, so curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a lot of interesting things there. I mean, the power of the Aurobindo ideal or figure, however one wants to put it, I can sort of sympathize with that. Uh, but maybe I'll come around to then why I find non-essentialism interesting or more drawn to that. Uh, Maybe partly through this example of the health that you brought up, right? So, uh, in my own thinking, I'm sort of like, yeah, according to this body mass thing or whatever, like I'm like, okay, I'm overweight. I need to lose weight. I need to get into this thing, right? So uh, there is a certain way in which we might think that there is an there is a truth of what the right weight is or something, right? But even that, it seems like it's also very malleable and variable, right? Because there is, I think even doctors might sort of say that, okay, this is sort of just a guideline. This isn't like, every person has to have this exact weight to be their real body thing, right? But I say, no, this is kind of like, you know, uh, it's a range, and that could vary from person to person, right? So there is no so the concept of healthy and the concept of what one's weight is might not actually map onto each other. So there could be, somebody, could be very skinny but be generally unhealthy, right? And then somebody who maybe is not skinny but is rather uh, uh, healthy in many ways, right? So that kind of cross connecting, I think, is sort of what to me is true for concepts in general, right? So that there is no uh, for any concept, whether it applies or not is so dependent on context. This is another thing that Wittgenstein was sort of really focused on, right? So that it is the contextual nature which moves me in the non-essentialist direction, right? Because in a way, uh, whether we want to claim whether it is health or whether somebody is being moral, whether they're being strong, whether they're being spiritual, right? Any of these things sort of seem to depend so much on the particular context of their life that uh, I wonder what is the if the essentialist view might not be a kind of uh, one size fits all kind of mindset, right? And so that is sort of for me the concern, and to some extent whether I'm not limiting my own self by imagining that there is a kind of uh, uh, essence that I need to be getting to, rather than sort of being sort of open into the plurality of ways that I can be. In fact, plurality of ways in which I can be healthy, or I can be spiritual, or I can be live a meaningful life, right? So for me, this is sort of the crucial element of it is, and I think this is not a semantic point, but I would say even it is a kind of metaphysical point that there are many ways in which I can live a flourishing life, many of which won't be my actual life, right? So that there's sort of this multiplicity to myself, so that there is there is a self that would be a spiritual being, um, you know, uh, like Aurobindo, or like uh, you know, Thomas Merton or something, which I can sort of be like, okay, that's a category that I'm fitting. But then there's a very different life, and I think for me, I suppose, like for example, being a parent is connected to this, right? So there's a different version of my life in which my life doesn't look and feel neither like Aurobindo's nor like Wittgenstein's for that matter, and uh, but which is sort of very much grounded in like my kids, and yes, often I feel this temptation to be like, okay, which side is more me, or how do I balance these sides of me, and so forth, and but to some extent, if I were to sort of just be like, I'm drawn to being completely focused as a parent, then, and suppose I don't do philosophy, like I don't do philosophy as much, right? Am I somehow being less spiritual, less philosophical as a result? Right? And I think uh, in some ways, yes, but in some ways, no. Right? What I feel like saying, because what is the deep energy that is guiding me cannot be predicted in that way. Right? And so to me, the anti non-essentialist view feels more spiritual because it is tapping into this kind of complete sense of possibility of my being, right? And it could go in any direction. And I'm sort of following that energy, right, without being constrained by our societal or concepts of, oh, that's what it is to be spiritual, that's what it is to be sort of healthy, that's what it is to be living a flourishing life or whatever, right? And to somehow tap into where does it come from within me rather than from outside, right? And how this connects to the Aurobindo point, I think is fascinating because uh, maybe for me, I was drawn to the non-essentialist once at a certain point I lost this kind of guru figure in my life. Right. And so I used to have a guru figure. Even Aurobindo, I think, played that role to some extent. But I mean, I think not the way he probably does for you, I think. But maybe my father played that role. Um, I could think about other people where I was sort of like, okay, I'm trying to become like that. And then at a certain point, I think it became kind of like, eh, I don't know if there's anybody I'm trying to become. And it was just kind of like this incredible deflation I felt in my life. Like this kind of like, um, but then somehow in that deflation was a kind of soothingness also, right? Because it was sort of like, okay, I'm not looking elsewhere. Uh, and I'm not inclined to think that there's one right answer to this. In fact, as a non-essentialist, I'm like, no, there's no, it's not like one of us has to be right at this point. I think as a consistent non-essentialist cannot be like, my view is the right view. So, but it's more like uh, being with that sense of uh, shifting dynamics. Yeah,
Mhm.
if that makes
Yeah,
sense.
yeah, a number of interesting points here. So I'll try to address them um, as they came up. So one with this view of health. So I think this is a good example to at least throw a thought experiment in there. Um, so you notice that there's no one way to be healthy. Maybe there's no single ideal. You could be healthy as a bodybuilder. You could be healthy as a vegan um, enthusiast. You can be healthy as a swimmer or runner, and you can have different body types. One might be more muscular, or one might be leaner. But I still think that there's some sort of sense that you get when you're around somebody and they're like, wow, this is a healthy person. And I think I have not exuded that sense. And though I'm in an initiative to try and change that right now, um, I think up to this point, I have not had that quality of like, wow, this is a deeply healthy person because of different habits and attitudes that I've had. Whereas somebody else might have um, that essence, and you could look at them and there's a certain vibrancy that they might have. And I mean, I think there are a lot of people like that who care about health and they have a good diet and they exercise regularly and they have no major diseases. And sometimes they might even have their mental health together. And it's rare to have somebody that has all aspects of their life kicking and functioning on all gears and cylinders. But at the same time, it's not beyond the range of comprehension. I mean, there are people who are like very together in various aspects of their lives, and compare it to somebody who does not have those same things together, and you can get a sense of, again, the logos thing that I was talking about. If you put one of those kinds of people next to me, that difference maps out this terrain. There's the word healthy and there's the word unhealthy, and the energies behind healthy correspond to this side, and the energies behind unhealthy might correspond more to my side, and that's the so that's and if you look at all of those people, there might not be a single commonality between um again, like I said, you have different kinds of diets, you could have different kinds of practices, um but I think broadly it would be uh yeah, these categories of not having disease, not being relatively healthy and in their diet. And again, diet is a huge range of worrying ideas of different, there's so many different approaches from nutritional science and alternative diets, and nobody really agrees on what the healthiest diet is. It's kind of a mystery to even our most advanced science today. Like, what's really healthy? Is it low carb, or is it high carb, or protein, or meat, or whatever? So we haven't been able to locate that essential locus of healthiness in the dietary realm even. But still, you can there's some sort of uh, these different healthy people might have different diets, but there's broadly you can say whole foods rather than processed foods, and maybe more protein versus more fat and carbs and things like that. There's just a general slant and maybe a few different kind of dietary archetypes that you could point to, whether it be like this one's high protein and this one's more vegetable focused or whatever. Um, yeah, so I don't think health is as hard to break down as as you had said, and maybe if there's more contextual factors that you had in mind, I'd love to hear them. Um, so then for the point about this idea of multiplicity of lives, I think that's a really interesting question, and I don't know what because you're right, we could all have multiple lives that we lead, and those would have different. They would all be Bharath, or they would all be Ravi. They'd just be different kind of manifestations of that. And so, does that negate the idea that there's an underlying essence behind those lives? Um, so, I guess to that, I would say, well, one consideration is that uh, there is a kind of deepest spiritual essence behind any of us, which is found in the soul, and that's kind of like the the essence of a person is in their soul, and it's actually possible um, to be more or less in touch with that soul. So somebody who's not in touch with their soul might be somebody who's very just gets all their ideas from propaganda or whatever, and just follows whatever they're propagandized to do, and um, or just like social. That's a kind of charged term. Uh, the the social systems, and they're not really concerned with what's coming from inside them. Um, so yeah, they might follow a one kind of life that's not really in tune with their essence. So I think that that's one possible case, that somebody is not in tune with the essence of what they are, and that will um, yeah, lead to one set of outcomes. But even within the lives where you're in touch with this soul, or you're in touch with this essence, there might be a variability in how you express that essence. So the question um is that how does that relate to the essence of a person? So I think as example of Sri Aurobindo, um, like I think for example, I think there might be multiple paths here. Um, so I think it's more essential to Sri Aurobindo's path that he did spirituality rather than politics. So I think if he continued down the path um, of being an Indian independence leader and never heeded the call of his soul to get involved with spirituality, that would be kind of this less essential life than he ended up living. Although one could imagine that maybe spirituality and politics could come together later in his life, and there might be eventualities where he actually takes it up again. But I think what I mean is that if he chose to do that in a way that didn't heed the call of his soul, then that would lead to a less essential life. So if he heard the call of Krishna in 1908 and said, "No, I'm not going to follow the spiritual path. I'm just going to follow a political path," and then he just became a political leader without following the call of God, I think that would lead to a less essential life than if he followed that call of his soul.
So can I just jump in for a
Yeah,
second?
sure, sure.
Because this is a great example.
Yeah.
So, uh, right, if put that way, it feels like he's not being true to himself if
Hmm.
he didn't listen to the call of Krishna,
Hmm.
right, when he was in the prison, right? Uh, but what if we slightly change the scenario where we think that uh, the call of Krishna was for him to stay in the political uh,
Hmm.
realm, right?
Hmm.
Uh, and would would he would he have been the same Aurobindo in that scenario, right? So supposing he said, "Okay, I am feeling my deepest calling is to uh, is to fight the British for independence,
Hmm.
is to stay in India, not go to Pondicherry, right, and deal with whatever is going to happen there. Not that he was avoiding it, but that, but supposing he chose that path with several, I think, of his, I'm sure, political followers had wanted him to do. Um, yes, he wouldn't have become a philosopher in this way, right?
Hmm.
In the way he became, one of the great philosophers. Um, is there, of course, he would have lost out on something. We would have lost out on something, right? Humanity would lost out on something if he didn't pursue that path. But would he have lost out on who he was in some essential way? Um, that I'm not sure, right? I feel like, yes, he would have lost out on a path, and that losing out on that path would have repercussions for himself, for others, for society. But if instead he decided to suppose he decided to join the Congress Party or something, and then become a politician uh, in the mold even of uh, Gandhi or Nehru or something, and sort of vying for that in that mold, but being somehow his energy, right? Um, these are two very radically different Aurobindos, right? And maybe an Aurobindo who could have become the first prime minister of India, right? And now I'm thinking, yes, that prime minister Aurobindo is very far from my picture of Aurobindo, and in fact, who we think of Aurobindo now, right? Uh, and I kind of like the actual Aurobindo more because it just sort of feels like there are many people who could have become prime minister, and we know kind of the rules of that game and what are the things that person could have done. Um, but on the other hand, it's such a fascinating thought experiment because we sort of think, imagine if somebody like Aurobindo had become prime minister of India, what would India have become, right? What would a different path, right? Because that Aurobindo, it's not like that Aurobindo wouldn't have been spiritual and philosophical. Right? That Aurobindo would have been very spiritual. Radhakrishnan became the first president of India, but I think more like a figurehead. I mean, it wasn't like somehow his philosophy didn't, I think, infuse the nation in a certain way, I would think. But the possibility that a less explored philosophy nonetheless could have permeated sort of India or the world in that political domain feels to me extremely fascinating. And we might think that's who Aurobindo could have been, right? That would have been a very different Aurobindo. Now, is there a way, is there a sense in which one of these is somehow the real Aurobindo? Uh, I'm inclined to think, and this is probably where the difference comes from the two perspectives, I think, right? I'm inclined to think, no, there isn't. What distinguishes the Prime Minister Aurobindo from uh, the sort of Aurobindo ashram Aurobindo is situational forces, even psychological things that could have gone different ways, right? And that who we think of as Aurobindo in either context is partly determined by a lot of these situational factors that could have gone in any number of different contingent directions. And so it's kind of this openness to contingency, openness to variability um, that seems like uh, uh, actually to me very beautiful. In fact, it's kind of like the world for feels like, yeah, it doesn't have to be. Aurobindo didn't have to just become like this. He could have become like that. Maybe he could have been a professor at Cambridge. Like any number of different, he probably would have been a great philosopher in a very different way if he had become colleagues with Bertrand Russell. It was a very fascinating thought experiment, right? And does there have to be one thing here? And I'm not sure. I'm not sure why there has to be one thing. In fact, it seems kind of to me more mysterious to sort of think of it as, yeah, it could have been any of these things. And in fact, this is how the world is actually. Most people, we're talking about different ways in which somebody like Aurobindo could have realized their potential, but most people don't remotely realize their potential in any domain, right? And that's not because, and this to me is maybe the real worry I have, right? The real worry I have is that essentialism can, or maybe this is the pressure I put on myself, which I'm reacting against, that it can create this kind of like, if only each person wills it, they can achieve it, right? So it has this kind of Rand libertarian kind of feel of like, if I didn't make it as a professor or, if I don't, if I'm not a great thinker, then somehow it's because of some internal energy is out of whack, and I just need to get that internal energy to kick in and be right, right? And I think I'm kind of like, no, it's a lot of these things are because of circumstances and situations, and it's not helpful to put so much pressure on oneself in that way. And I have found it helpful to sort of let that go a little bit, right? Uh, Again, I'm not saying which one is the right one, but I think this is a way of sort of, for me, it feels like it's almost like taking some of the pressure off of myself so that I can get in touch with my space of potentialities within myself rather than sort of imagining that there is a way in which it has to play out.
Mm.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm definitely open to the idea of contingent factors shaping these essences and um yeah, two ideas for how that can be reconciled. One is the idea that the essence is kind of fixed and there's a contingent world, and we kind of implant the seed of the essence into the contingent world and see by the end of it what is the manifestation that this essence has under these conditions of contingency. Um, so, like we were talking about the other day at lunch, the category of intellectualism, uh, where in the contingent conditions of uh, the previous couple of hundred years, the category of intellectualism has flourished within the institution of academia, but now there might be uh, reasons to think that under the changing conditions of the internet and the institutional landscape, maybe that same categorical essence could be manifested more under the conditions of the internet content creation model. So the same underlying essence, changing conditions, and a new manifestation. So that's one way of thinking about it. Another way of thinking about it is that the process of contingency actually unveils the essence that was there beforehand. So in the first model, you know the essence up front and you put it through this contingent experiment. On the other hand, you could say that maybe the essence is unknown up front and it's contingency that reveals the essence. So it's this is the way you could say that, like, well, we only know who Sri Aurobindo was by the end of his life. We didn't know when he was, in England writing poetry. Maybe he could have been a great poet or a classicist. So that's untapped potential. But by the end of his life, through the choices he made, we see, oh no, the essence of Sri Aurobindo is this great spiritualist and philosopher. So again, that's again with these essentialist arguments, I feel I'm not it's more that they're compelling rather than that I think they're waterproof or
No,
watertight.
no, yeah, no. Yeah,
Um,
I think we're speaking of why are they compelling? Why is one compelling to you and one
yeah, yeah.
different for me?
Do you mind if I make one more point?
Yeah, yeah. No, go
Okay.
ahead.
So the other thing, as you were talking about this idea of contingent lives and stuff, I was thinking actually how my life is actually, I might have this essentialist position, but my own life I feel is very not organized by essentialism. And the fact that I don't feel like I found my own essence yet. And I feel like I'm between these categories and I've wanted for a long time to find the category that I fit under and just like you're saying, just kind of will and maximize that category. So when I was in high school and college, I wanted to be a jazz musician. I thought that was the end of my potentials, and I just will my life to be a jazz musician. And then I kind of lost that vision for whatever reason. And then since then, I've been trying to find like what is my essential nature, what is my what is the new category that I'm fitting myself into. And I feel like I'm between all these different categories and not sure what exactly is that nature. And right now I'm thinking, do I want to do this tech project? And I never thought about doing tech before, and I thought that was um, you know against my nature to do technology. I'm a creative spiritual person, and this is the line of thinking I had to go down, and I don't want to be involved with technology, um that's proving to be inadequate. So I think there's something powerful to the idea of not being bound to the categories that you would think under, and to be open to the fact that you might, in the process of living out your essence, you might have to transform the categories that you think about. Um, so what does that say about the categories? I think this is the model that I was thinking about just a second ago of the essence being revealed through the intermediate contingency. So earlier in my life, I might have thought more in terms of creativity as the most important thing and being a creative artist or somebody who's very creative. But now there might be other visions that are more compelling. So um, that that is to say that yeah. So I feel I do feel this tension in my life. I will say that I don't uh my life feels very shaped by this concept of contingency, and maybe it could have gone this way and maybe it could have gone another way. And I don't feel like I have that essential category of myself yet. Whereas I hope I don't mind if I peg you in another way, where I look at you and I say, wow, Bharat's a philosopher. This is a thoroughbred through and through philosopher. And you can debate analytically, like, is philosophy about living life, or is it about analyzing concepts, or is it about academia, or is it about blogging, or what is it about? Whatever that essence is, I think Bharat's a philosopher, and I think I'm, someone who's going in between different things. And um, yeah. So anyway, I don't mean to restrict your self concept
No,
or anything like that, but
no, I
yeah,
think it's a great
just
point.
yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, finish your thought. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's my thought. That's kind of funny that we have these viewpoints and then our lives kind of bear it out in a different way. Maybe.
Yeah, actually, I think it's a really good point because I want. This is where the relation of these ideas to biography and context are so crucial, right? So when you were saying this, I was kind of like, yeah, maybe I am trying to get out of my philosophy essence thing, right? Because I think in a certain way, there was a path that I wanted to be on since I was 16, and I was just on that path for many, 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 many years, right? And it didn't feel like my life was contingent. It felt very much like this is what it was meant to be, right? Uh, and in a way, I kind of feel like that constrained me in some ways, right? And so I'm kind of like still looking for this kind of like breaking out of that mold, right? And to sort of be open to other dimensions of myself. Uh, Whereas it's fascinating to think that biographically you pursued different paths and different sort of sides of yourself, an incredibly wide range of things, jazz, math, technology, poetry, spirituality, right? And so maybe you're tired of the multiplicity in a certain at some deep energy level, all right, or you're sort of seeking something, whereas I might be tired of this kind of singular energy, um, uh, kind of sense. um, I wonder if that's connected to something else, which I was going to say. That is, uh, one of the reasons why one of my questions about essentialism is I wonder if it isn't a kind of uh, fixation on famous people, right? And because when you were saying that Aurobindo's story is told from who he became towards the end of his life, not towards, but in his life as as it unfolded, um, I think it's very tempting to look at these paradigms of a subject like Aurobindo with spirituality, right, or Einstein or Picasso, Mozart, right, and sort of think that's who they were. That's who they were, right? Mozart couldn't have done anything else. That this is what he was put on earth to do, what he was born to do. We can't imagine Mozart as, I don't know, a cobbler. Like it just sort of feels like this would be like a grave injustice, right? That if Mozart had to sort of do something other than make music, right? Uh, and I feel that. I mean, of course, it's ludicrous to think Mozart. If somehow people were like, no, you can't you can't compose or play music. You have to do this. You have to work as a farmer, right? It feels like wow, the universe is so cruel. Um, but precisely because of that, I feel like our lives are shot through with that kind of cruelty, right? That most people don't get to be Mozart. And I wondered, nothing, I never thought about this before, but perhaps the essentialism thing broke for me when I left academia, right? Perhaps that feeling that this is what I'm going to do, this is what I'm going to be, or even maybe a few years after I left, because when I left, I was like, I'm now going to become a public intellectual, and this is going to happen. And when that didn't sort of happen in the way I imagined it would happen, uh, I felt like I had this kind of psychic choice to make. Either I could sort of implode by thinking I am not being who I need to be in life. Um, like I am like, of course, a much smaller version, but I am like that Mozart forced to be a farmer. Uh, I could take that approach and be like, I'm going to fight this. I'm going to fight it, keep fighting it so that until I can become the Mozart I can be. Um, or I could somehow put that pressure on myself down, right? I could sort of say, I could either align with the Mozart I wanted to be, or I could align with that Mozart who became a farmer and who didn't become famous, and who wasn't maybe an amazing farmer, but he was just a farmer, and he had a good life, right? I think there's a part of me, I think that is, this is a very deep tension in me, as I think you well know about me. Like, this is kind of this crucial tension of like this, and I think the way I experience it is between this kind of the beauty of the ordinary in a way versus the enthrallment of the extraordinary, right? And I think maybe the essential versus the non-essential have kind of morphed in my head onto these two categories, right? That I feel like my life is much more ordinary than I imagined it would become. And I don't see any prospects of it becoming extraordinary. Um, Maybe when I was in my 20s and 30s, that prospect was still looming, you know. Um, at this point, I don't think it's looming as much. And so it's like either I can be like, yes, I failed and I'll keep trying, or I can be like, it's okay. Like, it's okay. To even categorize it as failure seems to somehow put pressure on myself. And to instead sort of be like, this is growth for me. Like the way in which, say, my wife or my good friends, um, including you, I'm so supportive of my path. Of sort of be like, yeah, this is the path. You're on a good path, right? I guess that's I'm kind of trying to keep that part open, right? Of being like, yeah, it if what I do is mainly be a parent and live my day-to-day life and try to be healthy in a normal sense, um, enjoy thinking in a normal sense, right? If I am just one more of the millions and millions of people on YouTube, you know, uh, that's okay. Like that can be really fulfilling, right? Because it's not measured by uh, the achievement, but it's measured by the process, right? And so that's a kind of like identification with maybe the common person side of me, as opposed to the Mozart, Wittgenstein, Aurobindo, Vivekananda side, where they're kind of this kind of like mythical figures walking among ordinary people. Um, right? So I'm kind of like, yeah, maybe I'm drawn to like, and maybe psychologically I had to do this because my father was this mythical role in my life, and so I had to sort of break away from this kind of mythical thing. Um, uh, but yeah, this is a very fascinating combination of theory and therapy.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I don't know that what you're talking about seems to me like a question of essentialism or not. I mean, obviously there are these great figures in every field, but that doesn't define that's the greatest example of that essence, but that doesn't define the greatness isn't what defines the essence, I think. Um
But can you give
but
do you have an example of somebody who's realizing their essence without being great?
yeah, I mean, I think Sri Aurobindo is the essence of a great spiritual figure, but a lot of the people I know in the spiritual communities are people who are not, famous spiritual figures, but are still practicing the essence of spirituality in the sense of like doing spiritual practice and trying to be spiritual people in their daily lives and things like that. And I think that's just as imbued with the essence of spirituality as the greatness aspect. I think the greatness is something that's added on to the essence, maybe to create one of these figures. And um, I think in music, and that seems a little bit different, where like I think Coltrane imbues the essence of music in a way that like a child's piano recital does not. And I think that's a difference between music and spirituality. Um, that uh, that spirituality is kind of tied to living life in a way that music it can be a greater expression of music um, as you go up the levels of music. So I'm trying to think of what might be an appropriate analogy there. Um, Same with politics. I mean, like obviously, like Barack Obama is essentially a politician, and like the student class president is not essentially a politician in the same way. Um, so I think for some of these categories that the essence is kind of revealed further as you go up the ladder of these successes.
But that's kind of what I'm questioning
Well,
is
so I think for philosophy, I think philosophy is more like spirituality than it's like music. Uh, uh um,
I want to say they're all like music,
hmm,
right? Like
yeah,
like this is part of the way in which I wonder if in spirituality and philosophy, our society is not still so hyper focused on the great thinkers, right?
hmm,
And I wonder if we're at an age to get away from that, right? Because one might say that yes, with music, of course, Mozart, Coltrane, these are great figures. We cannot imagine, that we cannot imagine that's what they're meant to be doing. That is what their life is supposed to be about. Uh,
hmm.
I think my reaction, my thought about this is very similar, I think, to how somebody might stop believing in God. I think that this is how I've experienced it in my own life, right? I sort of think there's a certain kind of course, one can believe in God. Many people believe in God. Uh, and I completely respect that. I don't think there's anything. I don't have like an epistemic problem with it or moral problem with it. I think it can be amazing. But it seems like we don't want. It's not great to sort of somehow love God at one's own expense, right? So there has to be the loving God has to be an expression of one's own growth, right? But it's so common for people to, I think, love God at their expense or at the expense of their neighbor, right? Where it becomes a kind of chastising of oneself, right? And I think the appeal of atheism for many people, I suspect, is to get out of that self-chastising mode of being, right? Not that all God-believing people have to be that way. Of course not, right? I think many are not being that way. It's a genuine space of growth, uh, but it can become that way, and so leaving that little door open that yeah, maybe somebody else doesn't need to believe in God. Maybe they don't need to believe in the God I believe in. Feels like leaving open a little bit of their own energy that, oh, maybe I myself might have become somebody who believes in a different God or believes in no God. somehow that seems just good for a person's soul, right? Rather than being like, no, no, I'm meant to have become a Hindu or a Muslim or a Christian. And this is what I'm supposed to be. I'm supposed to be like this. And to me, that feels like a remnant of a bygone era of humanity, where we somehow are still like, there has to be one thing, rather than being like, yeah, there's any number of ways that our lives can go. And we need to be sort of open to that plurality. And sometimes the great people become blocks. Our relation to the great people become blocks because they kind of don't let us appreciate the plurality within sort of oneself, right? And maybe that's partly what made them great. Like, when I think about Aurobindo deep in sort of meditation or deep in a trance, or uh, sort of the higher reaches of consciousness, right? Uh, I imagine Aurobindo not at all the way that we think of Aurobindo. There is a disconnect there, that he is not thinking in those higher reaches of his consciousness, yes, I am now realized my true essence as a philosopher. But rather, I imagine he's kind of like seeing the way other people are seeing him as itself something very contextualized, right? And sort of he's looking at it with a kind of ironic gaze and smile. Like they think I am this person, that I'm somehow defined by this body and by this fame and by this talent, even. But I am not defined by these things, right? So yeah, so it kind of seems like somehow moving out of this kind of celebrity model of these great people, um, towards, I guess, frankly, towards the masses, somehow feels to me more in keeping with spirituality. Of, yeah, we don't, there, for every Aurobindo and Wittgenstein, there are millions of people who aren't as great at it as they were in that particular way, but maybe they were greater in other ways because they had to take care of their parents, or they had to deal with a disability, they had to deal with other things that are happening. And so somehow being open to that plurality of contexts in each other's lives seems to me somehow more freeing than keep focusing on, okay, like, yes, that you know uh, I needed to be the philosophy version of Miles Davis or something.
Mm.
um,
Well, so there seems to be this claim that that essences are only brought out in the most extreme cases, and that therefore to be kind of have this solidarity with the masses, we have to give up on essentialism because the mass of people don't have these great essences embodied through them. I don't know if that's exactly what you might say, but I think even something I've gotten from watching um, Teal Swan lately is her observations about people, how even anybody as part of the mass is going to have their own unique qualities that are kind of manifested through them, and their own idea that's moving through them, regardless of whether they're a great figure, just by virtue of their incarnation as a human with different potentialities and talents. They still have a unique essence or idea that's still moving through them. One person might be called to be an innovator, and another person might be called to be uh yeah, unconditionally loving towards their family, and one person might be called to be to practice crafts in a certain way that's not high elevated art, but just making beauty around in an ordinary way around. So I think there are all these. I think to say that the masses don't have any essence is almost like that is not seeing the variety that's present in the mass, the variety of essences that are possible even within the mass. To say that only the greats have the essence. I think the greats have the highest expression of the essence, but there are still all these yeah, different qualities and different essences that are present even as, and it's almost kind of overwhelming the variety of different psychological qualities and ideas and traits that can be expressed in these in this variety of huge number of people, and each one of them has their own unique ideas and gifts and tendencies, and it's not like there is an undifferentiated mass. They're actually as differentiated by the logos as anything else. um Again, just the logos being this thing that draws distinctions and says that on this side is one quality and on that side is the other quality of energy that is essential. So I don't know that the line of thinking you're going down is necessarily.
So are you separating essence from? So now, I mean, is this an interesting sort of path? Because if we say that everybody has their own essence, um, and that essence might not be the same as you know uh, the famous people's essences, the paradigms, the ones in the pantheon, right? Uh, okay, this kind of essence is something I can certainly latch onto. That everybody is trying to figure out their own sort of who they are, right? I guess then I wonder what makes it. What does the word essence doing there now, right? Like, what is it? Why? Because the essence, in a certain sense, feels like if it's like the Platonic form, then it feels like it's the thing that the instantiations share, in virtue of which they are that thing, right? And so normally, I think that I was resisting the great person thing because I feel like it's tempting to treat the great person as the form of spirituality, the form of music, or whatever. And then most people are just like these sort of bodily instantiations that are imperfect of that form. So there is sort of Aurobindo, and then there is all the rest of people, right? Or Aurobindo and the mother, and then the rest of people who are sort of variously trying to instantiate that essence. Um, but if we sort of say, no, it's not like that, it's not a hierarchy that way, it's not a form and matter kind of distinction, but sort of everybody has their own essence, which is kind of an interesting Aristotelian picture, where now form and matter are kind of interconnected. There isn't a as form isn't separable from matter in this way. Um, I'm much more on board this kind of thing. Then at that point, though, I wonder what is if people are searching for their essences in that way. If they're searching for an essence without searching to be like some image they have of a great person in that domain. Um, yeah, I guess I'm not entirely sure what is captured in that concept of essence.
Mm, yeah. So what came to mind is not sure if you're familiar with this, but the mother Mira Alfasa, she worked with the flowers extensively, and so there's a couple of books where she assigns spiritual essences to a whole bunch of different flower varieties. So The sunflower has, I don't remember, can't remember any of these off the top of my head. It was like the quality of like grace, and one quality has a quality of integrity, and one flower has a quality of mental clarity, or one flower has a quality of peace in the life force. So all these different essences correspond to all these different flowers. And there's not just like three flowers, but there's like hundreds of different flowers that are all express their own kind of idea and essence. And I think that's a little bit how I think about these personal essences. So there's not just one thing, it's just this huge variety and profusion of like psychological qualities, and they all have ideas associated to them. And they're not like grand things that are like very easy to point out, like philosophy and spirituality and Sri Aurobindo, or jazz and Coltrane. They're not as pronounced like that, but they're no less they're names that are associated to these spiritual energies in this vast profusion of different psychological qualities. That So if you think about the people in your life, they all have these different but specific qualities. Um, and those are the varieties of energies that they bring out, and each of those have names that can be assigned to them. So the essence, I'm not saying that each person has one and only one idea that's associated to them, but just that there's this yeah, that they do have these qualities that can be assigned to names, and those names um, are associated to the essences of these psychological vibrations. Um, and that again, there's a huge variety of them in the kind of mass of people that are not as associated with one category defining idea as the greats in the pantheon. Um, yeah, I'll see if I can
That
find
if
this
if I if I if
this
I'm
other book.
trying to be a good, like if I'm learning music, do you think that
Mm,
I'm trying, and I'm not very good at it at all, right?
mm,
I'm sort of very much a beginner. Like,
mm,
am I trying to be my musical? Am I trying to realize my musical essence by trying to learn to play the piano? Like,
mm.
why phrase it like you guys? Is it more helpful to phrase it like that, or to phrase it as just I'm doing something that I enjoy, and that I want to get better at, and sort of explore my creativity, right? And so there are any number of other ways I could phrase it, uh, without using this kind of uh, uh, essence way of thinking about. Because I feel like the essence, I, it's hard to know what to make of this, right? Are we having a kind of word disagreement or something like, or might say,
Mm.
or is it like you like vanilla and I like chocolate? Is this kind of the thing that we are, you know? I mean, I guess that would be my way of looking at it. I guess for you, it might be like, no, one of us is right and one of us is no. Maybe that's a straw man of your view. That's not. You don't necessarily have to think one of us is right and one of us is wrong, but you might think that uh, uh, yeah. I mean, it's an interesting thought of whether some sense of an essence is part of our very categories. Like if I want to be a good friend, then maybe I am something like the I'm trying to realize the essence of friendship or something, right? So there's some basic minimal sense in which our very concepts involve trying to achieve something rather than constantly deconstruct everything. No, I'm not. By being a good friend, I'm just trying to be somebody who listens well. They can list off these 12 properties and be like,
Mm.
that's what one is trying to do. And it seems like that seems to miss something. No, I'm just trying to be a good friend. That's a thing. It's a thing in itself, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, maybe that's the kind of thing you're saying, if I understand correctly.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think again, like I said, the analytic view of like, well, if you analyze it, there's not really any essence. There's not really any determinate distinction you can draw between this category and this category, or like, there's many different varieties of friendship. There's all these arguments are true, but I think that doesn't negate the idea that there is some like, I mean, there's it's the essence, there's some uh underlying uh and so how do you maybe I'm not I'm not rising to the occasion maybe of trying to defend it against these kind of analytic viewpoints that say, Socrates might say, well, is a friend this and a friend that, and find the contradiction. Maybe I couldn't stand up to that kind of grilling. Um, but it's just this overall orientation that I find um useful, and like I said, kind of deep with its connection to these other idealist and mystical viewpoints.
For
Seems
you, it actually doesn't feel pressury for you, like you're putting pressure on yourself. Like I think maybe that's how it feels for me, but for you, it seems like it doesn't feel that way.
well, yeah. I mean, like I said, as I was reflecting on what you were saying, when I think about my own life, I don't see the essence yet. Um, but I don't feel pressured because of the view. I'm not. So you're saying that you feel like if I call you a philosopher, does that exert a certain pressure on you, or what's the pressure you're feeling?
No, when you call me a philosopher, I just feel good about it. Yeah, okay, good.
Hmm.
That part of me is being seen, um, or maybe that's kind of who I am. Um, uh, but I guess I feel pressured insofar as I think, oh, if I'm a philosopher, then what kind of a philosopher am I? You know,
Mm,
what kind of what is it to be the kind of philosopher I am supposed to be, right?
mm,
And so then maybe the pressure starts, right? Because then it's kind of like, okay, well, am I living up to that? Am I achieving it? Did I fail at it? Right? And it seems like I would gravitate towards saying, yeah, I'm a philosopher. I mean, there's certain ways in which I'm not a philosopher. Okay, I don't make my living at it. I don't do this. I don't do that. I don't, not versed in meditation, all sorts of things that I'm not a philosopher at, in ways in which I'm not a philosopher. I'm a different kind of philosopher. Uh, but then there's also a sense of most people maybe don't think of me that way. It's like, okay, fine, I'm a philosopher in my own unique way, or not unique, but in my own life. Um, it's interesting. Now it feels like maybe I'm the one who's putting so much pressure on these concepts, right? Right? That feeling like, oh, if I'm a philosopher, then I have to be somehow validated publicly as a philosopher or something, so that I don't feel pressure about it. Whereas you might have a much more like, no, we're just talking about your sense of your own self. That's all. Not about how you're seen or whatever. Um, but for me, I do experience it. That's where the pressure start to seep in, of I have to be a certain way, and maybe this has to do with some biographical dimensions of feeling like when I was younger. It's like I think from philosophy for me in my teens, late teens, maybe was like jazz for you, right? So even though I've sort of stayed with it, in a way, it started in that way, right? And uh, some of the tensions of that early start still reverberate for me, right? So it's something like it's just I'm like so it has to allow for its own. breaks and ups and downs, even within the concept of philosopher, right? As opposed to maybe if somebody wasn't drawn to it until later in their life, then it could be in different things for who they want to be. Whereas philosopher for me is both, it's like the self I was in my teens, 20s, 30s, and now in my 40s, I'm like, each decade was a different kind of philosopher that I was trying to be, you know. So then it's like, well, what kind of a philosopher is that? What somehow unifies them all? And so to some extent, I just find it more soothing to just be like, they're all like, there's nothing holding it all together. It's just a bunch of concepts and a bunch of concepts that we as a society are willing to acknowledge with each other.
Mm. Yeah. I guess I could introduce another framing, which is that these essences or concepts or categories, they don't have to be kind of a demand for a dictionary definition. They could also be the opening to a question and an inquiry. So to say that you're a philosopher doesn't have to end the conversation with a definition of this is what philosophy is, but it could be an exploration into, what does it mean to be a philosopher? Why like justice is not the end of the conversation of the republic, but the beginning of the conversation of the republic.
Mhm.
So what does it mean? So like if I feel like I'm a little less of a philosopher than you, not in a pejorative sense, but just in a kind of spiritual essence sense, what does that mean about the definition of philosopher? What does it mean about the definition of our lives? And if philosophy is it constituted by academia? Is it constituted by life experience? Is it constituted by conceptual analysis? And it's the beginning of a rich, and there's and you can be guided by this sense that if this inquiry is leading in the wrong direction, you're being guided by, no, that's off chart for my essence. That doesn't align with my intuitive understanding of what philosophy is. I mean, you could be led into all sorts of um, different digressions um, and delusions, but you can chart yourself by saying, no, that doesn't track my essence of a philosophy. You say, you're not a philosopher. You haven't published any analytic philosophy articles last year. You're not a philosopher. I was like, no, that doesn't make sense. That's not the essence of philosophy, to me. Um, and so, um, yeah, it doesn't have to be the end of a conversation, but can be the beginning of a conversation. Um, and I think, like for me, uh like viewing these essences or categories at different points in my life when I was trying to find out what category do I fall into. um it's a helpful speculative exercise. It's like, okay, if I am this kind of like, if I'm a blogger, if I imagine that's my essence, what do I look like under this lens? And I can kind of see my potentials mapped through this lens of like, yeah, he's a blogger, he's a guy who writes blog articles, and you can see your potential refracted through this lens. And then like, I'm a businessman. What does it look like if my potentials are refracted through this lens? Or any other number of categories that you're kind of deciding between. Um, so again, kind of using this as a map or a north star to track yourself by. So I think that's the way in which it can be a um yeah, again, this is more of a framing than something that like corresponds to reality. And I think that's how all my the deep views I presented so far um are really, they can't really be considered as proofs about reality, in the way we'd like to think about correspondence. But yeah, wonder if that's useful for you.
Yeah, I think that is interesting. And in fact, the Socratic example is particularly interesting because one could say that, in a way, asking what is justice, what is truth, what is knowledge, these are all sort of from the non-essentialist point of view, these are all kind of confusing questions or confused questions because there is no one thing any of these things are. So asking what is justice is a kind of confused question. This is actually the Wittgenstein view, right? It's like the question itself is somehow bogus, right? And yet, what you're saying is also really correct, I think, right? Because often these questions aren't meant as these are meant to start the conversation. They're not meant to sort of end the conversation. They're not meant to sort of, and there's to be one thing we're looking for, just that one thing, right? And even Socrates, it also feels like Socrates sort of was somehow being unfair to his interlocutors because like, tell me that one thing, and when they can't, then he's like, oh, what you disappointed me. How you don't, you thought you claim to know what friendship or justice is, but you actually don't know, right? Uh, but maybe it would be better if Socrates treated it as, yeah, these questions are just a way for us to talk. There doesn't have to be a disappointment at the end of it. It doesn't be like, hey, you didn't tell me what you thought you knew. We just are having a way to have a conversation. And actually, this gets to what I maybe what I fundamentally believe. And maybe as we're wrapping up here, maybe this could be something to put on the table. We could pursue another time. That I think what is fundamental of importance are the conversations themselves, right? Or the relationships, the interactions. Um, Even with one's own self, the relationship to one's own self, the conversations one has with oneself and with other people. Uh, what are important is not does one have this view or that view or which view is the right view, um, but the energy of the conversations and the energy of openness it is creating for the people in the conversations, right? And I think your point, I think, is well taken. I like it that in sometimes asking it in essentialist language can open up different energies, right? So I think somehow banishing something, no, we're not going to talk that way, doesn't seem useful, you know. Um, and so it could be more a focus on what does it mean to be sort of more open to each other. So uh, I think that I really do like that point. I like, I don't want to see, for example, this conversation through the lens of oh, you're an essentialist, I'm an anti-essentialist, or who's right, as much as these are kind of tools that we're using to somehow engage with each other and sort of connect, right? And it's not like the focus shouldn't be on the tools, the focus should be on us. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, cool. Um, I guess so. We can start to wrap up, like you were saying. Um, any other concluding remarks, or was that your kind of conclusion?
Yeah, I guess I think that is sort of my conclusion,
Mm,
that the focus is on the people and on the interactions.
mm,
And I do think that it's unfortunate that I think often people miss that because they get hung up on the on sort of the essence or an idea in some other way, rather than, even famously Wittgenstein, some of my favorite anti-essentialists like Wittgenstein and Rorty, Dewey, uh, uh, maybe were not appreciative of other people in some ways. Like famously, with Rorty, I think probably deeply misunderstood Descartes and Kant and so forth because he was sort of seeing them constantly through this lens of, oh, they're these essentialists and they're wrong and they miss this and they miss that, as opposed to sort of maybe in some ways getting in touch with why they do speak to so many people. Right? There's something there that seems to draw them in, when they read Descartes' Meditations, or when they read Kant or Hegel or something. And there's sort of, so being open to the energies of that might be more, I think I find more compelling than with the concepts as such. Either way. Yeah.
Hmm.
Anybody, what about you? Any last, what thoughts do you have? Any last thoughts?
Yeah, I would say that well, I guess my basic orientation is more or less the same. I don't think essentialism is the kind of I don't know that it stands up to every possible, analytic argument, but I think it's still basically compelling for various reasons. And I do appreciate the analytic arguments, as I think I told you in a recent conversation with some of the tech stuff I'm getting into. I'm actually finding that this kind of anti-essentialist viewpoint is actually more helpful because computers don't understand essences. You have to like really break things down for them to understand. And some of these analytic approaches to categories are more helpful actually for them. Um, so yeah, I appreciate that point, and I appreciate this, and I definitely will think about this contradiction you raised or inspired in me about my own professed essentialism and my lack of essentialism in my life story so far. Um, yeah, so I thought this was a productive conversation, and yeah, hopefully we can continue with this.
Okay, that sounds great.
All right, thanks, Bharat.